In this episode of Great Recordings, I want to talk about Antonio Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, La Quattro Stagioni. Now, for me, this is a very, very important work, written 300 years ago. I want to talk about it because it's still very relevant today. It's influenced a lot of music, even prog rock and albums that were recorded in the late 20th century. And it's an amazing work, but I also want to talk about the person who performed this great recording. So this video is going to be split into three parts. The short introduction, this part now. Then I'm going to talk about the composition itself, how it's formed, its structured, its background, etc., and a bit on Vivaldi. And then I'm going to talk about the person who I've chosen to perform this work, this great recording, because it did revolutionize the way that the public engaged with classical music and made it far more accessible to a much wider audience. But enough of that. Let's go back to the beginning and Antonio Vivaldi and 1717, because between 1717 and 1718, 1720, we believe that Vivaldi was composing the Four Seasons. In fact, he was composing 12 concertos for violin and orchestra. Now, these concertos are not like the late Romantic concertos of Brahms, very long and needing 40 minutes for themselves, just one. No, these are quite short. These are like 10 minutes each. And each of them is broken into three parts. And very crudely put, you would say there's a fast section for the beginning, and then there'll be a slow section, and then there'll be a fast section at the end. Now, as you can imagine, what Vivaldi did, because he was a brilliant virtuoso violinist, he was obviously wanting to write pieces for himself to show off and perform and to wow his audience. Because in those days, audiences didn't just sit in chairs in silence like it was some religious ceremony. No, some of them would start talking to one another. So he had to grab their attention and he had to pull them in on the journey. And he came up with this idea of basically a concept album. Now, they didn't have recordings, of course, then, but the idea of having 4 concertos, each one of about 10 minutes each, with shorter pieces in between, that each broken into short pieces between 2 and 4 minutes, and each concerto depicting a different season of the year. Now, because Vivaldi was also an impresario, somebody who went out and organized concerts, and so it had to motivate sponsors to get behind him and allow these things to happen. Well, you can imagine him going to as a rich person and saying, look, I've got this collection of 4 concertos. They only take 40 minutes in their entirety, and each one is going to depict a season of the year, and it's going to be brilliant. And I've even written some lyrics for it to go with it. Now, these lyrics are very interesting. We don't know for sure whether Antonio Vivaldi actually wrote them himself, but we guess he did. And what's interesting about the lyrics is he wrote the lyrics, and he basically wrote actually onto the manuscript, you know, like dog barking or cuckoo or whatever. So the lyrics were there for the musicians to get an idea of what he was doing and what he was talking about. But they were also for the audience too, I'm sure. Maybe at some of the performances he actually had someone to read them out. I mean, I can give you an example of just one, how it works, and I will put them all in the description at the bottom so you can read the lyrics, and if you listen to the 4 concertos you can follow each movement and each part with its own lyrics. But for example, in the spring, in the slow movement section of the spring, he writes, "On the flower-strewn meadow, with leafy branches rustling overhead, the goat herd sleeps, his faithful dog beside him." And it's that kind of imagery that he uses that is so fascinating, because I don't know of it happening before. And it is what we call program music, or what we would call, if we were referring to Dark Side of the Moon, or even before then, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles, a concept album. And if you think about it, here's the LP version that I have. It has 12 tracks, each between 2 and 4 minutes long. It's 40 minutes in total, 20 minutes each side. It seems that the attention span of the 18th century audience was no different than that of ours today. So there we are with the performance. Now, what is also interesting is that Vivaldi chooses a different key for each of the movements. So the first movement, it starts with spring, and it's a very, very famous melody. I'm sure you know the melody already. And that's in the key of E. It's solid, it's full of energy, ready of life and jollity. And E is a great instrument for stringed instruments, a key for stringed instruments to play in. And then for the summer, he moves up into this G minor, which is sultry. It's not an English summer. It's not wet and windy and disappointing and drab with the odd hot burst. No, this is a hot Tuscan or Italian summer, which is baking, or maybe even Sicilian. And the shepherd boy is lying in the meadow asleep with his dog beside him, and he's sweltering in this heat. So Vivaldi's taking it up into G minor, and then for the autumn, he drops back a tone into F, where you have that, again, that strength and the fierceness which the orchestra is allowed to display, and it ends with this really nasty hunting scene with the shooting of the dogs and the hunters' guns, and Vivaldi actually mentions it. And here in the recording, you'll hear that Nigel Kennedy conducts it in such a way that the string players are banging their instruments with their bows, and it really is quite an electrifying experience. And it ends in winter with this icy, cold, cold winter. And what does he do? He just drops it back from F major to F minor, and it just gives that wonderful effect. We're going to illustrate that with the music as I talked, for copyright reasons, obviously. But I do have a guitar in the studio. I don't have a piano in my listening room. I brought it in just to show you. Here we go. I mean, just to show you what those 4 chords for the different keys sound like. Here's the spring. It's full of life, full of energy. And then it moves up to this lovely G minor. And he actually uses a lute and violin in the summer to really get that hot, sultry feeling. And then for the autumn, of course, it's back in the F major. And then he just drops for the winter. It's very haunting, beautiful. You should try it. Now, that's the music. Why did I choose the version that I did? The version from Nigel Kennedy. I did it because there are lots of recordings. There's more than 1,000 recordings of the 4 seasons, each of them different, each with a different interpretation. And before Nigel Kennedy's recordings, there was one in 1939 made in France. It's really more of a transcription on a disc from a live performance, I think. And there was one in 48, which was quite an important recording. And then Sir Neville Marriner did a definitive one in, I don't know exactly when it was, I think it was in the 80s, with the Academy of Ancient Music. But this recording was recorded in 1987, in 2 days over 1987. And he went back in 1989 just for 1 day, just to finish it off. And it was recorded in St. John's Church in Hackney in London, a beautiful church, a beautiful echo acoustic, really nice acoustic. And Nigel Kennedy's directing it. So he's actually taking it just like they would have done in the 18th century, where there was no conductor. That came way later. The violinist with the bow or whatever, or the harpsichordist, would take the lead and indicate to all of the musicians where they want them to come in and what sound they want to get from the orchestra. And Nigel Kennedy was considered a rule breaker, but I think he was badly misunderstood, even by myself at the time. I always thought he was a bit showy, but all these years later, looking back and reflecting, you can better understand why it was. But because he was a sort of rebel, and because the way he got this performance to such a high level, this record sold 2 million copies. 2 million copies, which for classical music at that time was unheard of. And it popularized classical music. It made it accessible. Unfortunately, it meant that every bloody supermarket in the UK was playing the Four Seasons, the spring from the Four Seasons, and driving me mad. And I would say to you, if you're going to listen to this after this recording, don't start with the spring. Start with the winter and listen to that, and then go back to the beginning, because the winter, it's not the main tunes that are put in, and there's loads of them, these big hitting melodies. It's not those that are important, but the space in between and the development around them, which is so exciting. Now, I've got the LP here and I've got the CD. And what is interesting from a hi-fi perspective is the fact that when I put this CD on, I put the LP on at exactly the same time, and I started them simultaneously and just switched from one to the other using the same amplification system and everything, of course. And what I found was there was almost no audible difference between the CD and the LP. Now, of course, the LP had the odd pop and crackle and whatever, but not too bad. But I mean, that was audible. But I'm talking about the dynamic range on the CD was no more than the LP. And this is the early days of recording. And Mike Hatch was the engineer for this recording. And if I tell you that in the year this came out, Mike Hatch made 40 recordings. I mean, on top of that, that's just the ones listed on Discogs. I mean, he must have made others, I guess. So this was like a production line. But the recording is not amazing. It's good for the time, but it was one of the early digital recordings. And I think they mastered it exactly the same for the CD as they did for the LP. And obviously they had to bring out an LP because a lot of people were still buying LPs at that time. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to Nigel Kennedy, because Nigel Kennedy is a very interesting person. He was born on the 28th of December in 1956. That makes him about roughly 6 months older than me. He grew up in the UK, but his grandparents, were both musicians. His father was an Australian cellist who played in some very big orchestras in the UK. And his mother was a pianist. Now, they met in the UK, but shortly after Nigel was born, his father disappeared back off to Australia. Now, this is important because it meant that the young Nigel, as a baby, for his mother to earn a living as a pianist, she must have given up her concert life at that point for her child. She had to earn money by teaching piano, for example. So Nigel, the baby, would literally be put under the grand piano whilst her mother was giving lessons. And it soon transpired that as soon as Nigel got to toddling and whatever and got a little bit bigger, he had this natural ability with piano. He could just pick out all the Fat Swallow jazz tunes without being taught at all. So his mother started to teach him. But by the age of 7, he was sent off, and I think it's important that I use that words, to the Yehudi Menuhin school. The great violinist Yehudi Menuhin had a music school for brilliant young people. And he was sent off and he was taught the violin. Now, he didn't like the violin at first because he found it very screechy and difficult to make a note, whereas a piano, you hit a key, the right note comes out. But he persevered, and he's obviously very competitive with himself and with others, and he became a really brilliant violinist. And as he said in an interview somewhere, it's not really the technique. He said, well, anyone can learn to play the fiddle, as he calls it, to a very high level. I'm not sure if it's true, but let's assume that if you have the concentration powers, you can. Anyone can take them to a very high level, he says. But not everyone can find ways of expressing the music that touches people. And he certainly could. So at the age of 16, he leaves the boarding school where he basically lived under the guidance of Yehudi Menuhin, as I said, and he had already met Stefan Grappelli whilst at that school, the great jazz violinist who was a friend of Yehudi Menuhin. And he set off to New York at the age of 16 to go to the Juilliard School of Music in New York, as I say. Now, you can imagine 16 leaving on your own. It's a completely different culture, different environment. But, and this is the point, he did so well at Juilliard. Not only did he give his first concert at Carnegie Hall at the age of 16 when he first arrives with Stefan Grappelli, he's studying jazz and classical, but classical at Juilliard, absolutely. And the amazing thing is by 77, he's qualified at Juilliard with the maximum score, which had never been awarded before. I don't know if it has been since, but this was exceptional. So he sort of hung around New York for a while, experiencing all the different music and clubs, jazz clubs, and playing in different environments. But then he headed home in 1980, if you can call it home, back to the UK anyway, in 1980. And there he gave his first big concert performance of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. But I've got a list here somewhere, I think. Yeah, here we go. Look, just look at this. 1984, he records 3 albums, 2 jazz, and the multi-award-winning Elgar Concerto with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, we've got to understand that at this point, he's doing 120 concerts a year. Now, it's quite normal for a rock band to do many more than that because they're playing the same material going round on a tour. No, in this point, he's actually having to play jazz, he's playing the Elgar Violin Concerto, he's probably preparing the Bartok and the Tchaikovsky, because in 1986, he records the Bartok Concerto and the Tchaikovsky, which are massive works that take a lot of preparation. So no doubt he was playing them to live audiences and then going into the studio and recording. So in 1986, of course, it goes on to 1987. He then does the viola concerto, not the violin concerto, the Walton viola concerto. Again, an amazing piece. It stands the test of time, a great performance. And then he does Let Loose, which is a jazz album. So really this dichotomy. And of course, he's recording the first 2 days of our 4 seasons. 1988, he does the Mendelssohn, the Bruch, and the Sibelius violin concertos. I mean, this is madness, doing all 3 in 1 year. And in 89, the 4 seasons is finally released. And later he goes on to record the Beethoven, the Brahms, incredible. And I just want to say about the Beethoven, there's a live recording of him with Klaus Tanstadt, the German conductor. Amazing recording with the NDR Symphony Orchestra. It's live, and it just shows you what he was doing live. And what I find very, very interesting is it depicts Nigel's character so brilliantly. I mean, Nigel was famous for wearing his favourite football team's scarf around his neck, and and his spiky hair, and everybody sort of thought that was gimmicky. But it started with this. There's a famous story that his teacher, a very strict woman, Dorothy DeLay at Juilliard, she would really push him really, really hard. And there is a story that he told that she would stand before him just before going on stage, and she would check that his tie was correct and his jacket was correct and everything was fine, and then she'd say, right, on you go. And then the door clicked behind him, because obviously they need doors in classical concerts to make sure there's no background noise from outside of the hall coming onto the podium. So he walks onto the podium, but Nigel hates playing in a tie, the violin. You can imagine it's uncomfortable, and a jacket. He found that the jacket restricted his movements. So as soon as he got onto the stage, he took his jacket off, dropped it on the stage, took his tie off and dropped it on top of that, and then undid his button, started to play. And of course, what was happening, the audience thought it was amazing. They'd never seen anything like this before, so they were applauding, applauding, applauding. And I can imagine there were a lot of men in the audience who were also forced to wear ties and jackets because they were going to a classical concert. You know, all that snobism at that time was unbelievable in the classical world. No wonder young people just didn't want to have anything to do with it. And here was a guy and he might talk to the audience before, you know, in his very strange accent and vocabulary. So he won the audience over, and of course the applause would go on for a long time before he even started playing, and it was quite a long time before his teacher found out what was going on. But by then Nigel Kennedy had learned that if it's to the audience advantage and if it's to the performer's advantage to break a rule, then why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you talk to the public before you played something, instead of just coming on like a pompous ass, expecting everybody just to read it in a program? And that was that connection he made. And if you look at the video, and I'll pop a link into the description along with a whole load of other things to this video. If you look at the video, I think it's 1992, of him walking on stage with Klaus Tenstadt to perform the Beethoven violin concerto. It's Klaus in his evening jacket, you know, his long black tails and his white shirt and his white bow tie, and all the orchestra in their bow ties and really looking like penguins. And then there's Nigel with his bandana on and his jacket, just completely different style, just exactly how he wants to dress, how he feels comfortable. And that was shocking, but it changed the way that we saw classical music. And with the sale of 2 million records, it meant that there's a lot of people who didn't normally go to classical concerts were now engaging with this music. So thank you, Nigel, for that. That was a brilliant, brilliant advancement. So there you are, there you have it. I think it's very worth exploring this LP. And there's one other thing, that if you find classical music difficult to get into, just listen to one of the 4 concertos at a time. As I say, pick the less obvious ones. Go for winter, go for autumn, then go for summer. That's so beautiful. And look at all the different colours and sounds that he's got, and then play the spring, so that you can then play it right the way through eventually. Even put it on in the background so you get used to the sound of it. But if you find that difficult, then try another recording that Nigel made called the Doors Concerto, which came out in the year 2000. I find it fantastic, actually. He's got the famous tracks from the Doors. It opens with Riders on a Storm, but there's a great version of Light My Fire. Just try that. And it's in a classical format, but it's got the essence and the music and the beauty and the subtlety of the songs written by the Doors. Well, I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to having you back again in the next video. But until then, enjoy your music, and thank you for watching.